Preservation Evoker has a unique playstyle that revolves around positioning correctly to get the most out of your spells, and its incredibly fun and fluid damage rotation feels like it's part of the class, unlike some healers who feel very disconnected when using damage abilities. So before we talk about our core spells, we're going to talk about our mastery, Lifebinder. Our healing done to allies is increased by a certain percentage based on our mastery, while their health percentage is lower than our own. This means that in most cases, it's going to be important to make sure that we are topped off first before we start healing other players or putting priority into other players to ensure that we're getting the most out of all of our healing. So while we aren't going to talk about every single spell that's available to us as an evoker, we are going to talk about the core spells and break them down into different categories to better understand their uses. First off, our sustain healing spells. These are spells that we're going to be pressing the most and trying to get as much use of as possible because they are either low cost, free, or just very efficient to cast. This includes Living Flame, Reversion, and Echo. Living Flame is a single target cast, and it will just do a moderate amount of healing, but it also serves as a damage spell. So we can also cast this on an enemy and it will do damage to them. We cast it on an ally, it will do healing to them. So think of it as mixing something like Flash Heal and Smite for Priest together into one button. Reversion is a low cooldown heal over time effect that applies to one ally, and it's an extremely efficient heal to use, so we want to be used to pressing it as often as possible. In addition to our mana, Preservation Evoker has an additional resource called Essence. And the first way to spend this Essence is by casting Echo, which is a short heal over time effect on an ally, and then it also puts a buff on them that will duplicate the next non-Echo healing spell that we cast on someone else. So as you can see, I apply Echo to the hunter, I target myself with a Living Flame, and it bounces and also duplicates a second Living Flame to my Echo target. This can also be applied to multiple targets, so in raid and dungeon content, you can do some really interesting things with it. Next up, we have our burst healing spells. These are spells that typically have a kind of long cooldown or do a heavy amount of upfront healing that we'll be using in dangerous situations. This includes Verdant Embrace, Dream Breath, and Spirit Bloom. Verdant Embrace is an instant heal to a target. The only caveat to this is that you have to fly to the target. So it will fly to the target that you choose and then heal them for a heavy amount. You can also cast this on yourself. So if you use something like Echo, which we talked about previously, you can go ahead and use Echo on other players and then just Verdant Embrace yourself and it will duplicate to them. The next spell we have is Dream Breath. This is an empowerment spell, and the empowerment level changes depending on how long you hold the spell. When you press it the second time, that's when you let go of it, and then it will cast at whatever empowerment level you had it at. The spell requires very specific positioning, so be careful because it is a frontal cone, so if you're too close or too far away, you may have troubles hitting the people that you're trying to hit with this ability. Last up, we have Spirit Bloom, which is another empowered ability, meaning that we can let go of it whenever we choose at level 1, 2, or 3 empowerment during the cast time. And this will heal an ally for a certain amount, and then also heal other allies nearby, depending on how many times we empowered the spell. For each empowerment level, it heals one additional ally. Next up, we have our utility spells. This is going to include Naturalize, Time Dilation, and Tip the Scales. Naturalize is our cleanse ability, and this removes magic and poison effects from the target. In addition to this, I will mention Cauterizing Flame, which is a talent option that we have, which we'll probably be taking in most cases, especially in dungeon content, which is an additional cleanse that's on a 1-minute cooldown, and mainly it heals and removes bleed effects from the target. Next up, we have Time Dilation. This is our external cooldown, and it works in a very interesting way compared to other healers in that it causes 50% of the damage that your target would take to instead be dealt over time. So it reduces damage, but it doesn't remove the damage completely. It then deals it over time, so kind of like stagger, like a Brewmaster Monk if you're used to healing them. So when you do use this on somebody, you do need to be prepared to keep healing them because that damage is still going to roll in that they would have otherwise taken. And lastly, for our utility spells, we have Tip the Scales, which is just a 2-minute cooldown that makes our next empowerment ability instant cast and at maximum empowerment level. This is really useful for when you don't have time to cast those empowered abilities like Dream Breath or Spirit Bloom, but you need to get that big healing out immediately. Next up, we're going to talk about our damage spells. Living Flame, Azure Strike, and Fire Breath. Living Flame is our sustain healing spell, but as I mentioned before, it also serves as a damage button. So we can press this on an enemy while they're targeted, and it will just send a moderate amount of damage towards them. Azure Strike is an instant cast ability and will cleave onto targets. So typically this is what you would use instead of Living Flame if there's multiple targets. And lastly, we have Fire Breath. This is just like Dream Breath, except a damage version. So it's an empowerment spell. We can charge it up to any amount of levels that we want, and then blast it at our enemies, making sure that they are in the cone. This is a much smaller cone than something like Dream Breath, as you can see. So make sure you're aware that you have to keep that targeting reticle on the enemies in order to actually hit them with this Fire Breath. Alright, so we talked about our core spells, and now it's time to break down our healing rotation, which seems complex when we look at all of our core spells, but once we actually break this down, it's quite simple. The first thing is pressing Reversion on cooldown. This is such an efficient heal, so pressing it as much as possible is going to be really important. Next up, we want to spend our essence on either Echo or Emerald Blossom. And I know I didn't mention Emerald Blossom earlier, but just think of it this way. If you're in dungeon content, press Echo, and if you need to do a large amount of AoE healing, preferably in Raid, or when you take certain talents, you'll be pressing Emerald Blossom instead. Then, next up on our priority list is going to be pressing our burst healing spells when we need them. So again, we have Reversion on cooldown. We spend our essence on either Echo or Emerald Blossom. And then we want to be pressing our burst healing spells as we actually need them, which is going to be Dream Breath and Spirit Bloom. Then, once we've done all of those things, we just resort to casting Living Flame to do healing until those other abilities come back up. So now that I have more essence to spend, we can do that. And here, when we get these procs right here, this just makes our next essence ability free. We're casting Echoes, we're casting Emerald Blossom. We're back to keeping Reversion on cooldown. Now we don't really have anything, so we can use a burst healing spell. Now we go back to spending some essence. Don't have anything, so we can cast Living Flame. And that's pretty much the rotation. Keep Reversion on cooldown. Spend essence. Use burst healing spells. And then fill with Living Flame. And that's the basics of the rotation for Preservation Evoker. Alright, and lastly we have our damage rotation, which is super simple, but very fun and satisfying. So first up, we're going to be pressing Fire Breath on cooldown. We want to press this as many times as possible whenever it's up, because there's even talents that we'll end up taking in certain types of content where Fire Breath will heal allies whenever we deal damage with it. So we press Fire Breath. Now what do we do when Fire Breath's on cooldown? Because it is quite a long cooldown. We then simply press Living Flame if it's single target. And if there's multiple targets, we press Azure Strike instead to fill. And that's pretty much it. Other than that, we do have one more damage button that we can press. It's on a 2-minute cooldown, so I didn't include it in the rotation, but it's similar to Fire Breath. You can just try to press it as much as you can, which is Deep Breath. So the rotation is just use Deep Breath and Fire Breath as often as you can, being sure that you aim it carefully so it hits all the targets you want it to, and then fill with either Living Flame or Azure Strike. Azure Strike in AoE, Living Flame in single target. One thing to mention about Living Flame, make sure that after every Fire Breath, you press Living Flame at least once, even in AoE, because as you can see, it does bounce, or it does replicate and chain to multiple targets after casting a Fire Breath. So you press Fire Breath, then you press Living Flame, if this is talented, and it will cleave to everything around it. And then you can fill with Azure Strike if it's AoE. So again, just to go over it one more time, Fire Breath and Deep Breath as much as possible, then just fill the gap with either Living Flame in single target or Azure Strike in AoE. And that's it. Hope you're having fun on Evoker. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you guys have a wonderful time with the launch of Dragonflight. Or maybe, if you're further down in the patches and it's 10.2 or 10.3, I hope you're enjoying the expansion. Have a good one.